Let's move straight on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Sarah Garfinkel, who's a senior lecturer at University of Sussex, and she will tell us about interoceptive signals from the heart and how they can guide cognitive and perceptual experience.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today and hear so many wonderful talks and meet you all. So today I'm going to talk to you about how interoceptive signals from the heart can guide our perceptions, our cognitions and emotions. And the way I'm going to approach this talk is I'm going to do it in two main halves. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how sensing bodily changes, so internal bodily signals, can guide our cognitions and emotions. So how do these physiological signals serve as an extra channel of information that can guide this processing? So that's the sensing component. And then I'm going to progress to a second half, which is about the processing of cognitions and perceptions themselves, and talk about how bodily signals can actually change or influence the way the signals are processed. So I'm going to start off with emotions, because this is a thing that's been studied most widely, and it's also the most accepted. So emotions are expressed in both brain and body. You get these lovely signatures of emotion expressed in the body. Pupil dilation is one of them. Wonderful beat-to-beat blood pressure changes and systolic and diastolic blood pressure. The heat maps that were shown to be associated with different emotional states in 2013. And my favorite, which is the heart, which doesn't beat regularly and instead has these patterned responses associated with it. And you also have neural activity in the brain. This is associated with salience and emotional states. And the role of the body and emotion has been long known. So William James in 1884 discussed how it's actually sensing bodily changes that give rise to emotional feeling states, so that the body changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feelings of the same change as they occur is the emotion. So he actually equated the sensing of bodily changes with the emotion itself. And then interoception can be formally defined as a body-to-brain axis of sensation concerning the state of the internal body and its visceral organs. And essentially it's also the sensing or detection of internal bodily changes such as the heart and other visceral organs. And interoception can be contrasted from exteroception, which is sensing of the outside world, through more traditional senses, such as sight and vision. And this can then also be contrasted to proprioception, which is sensing the position of the body in space. And my work, together with Hugo Critchley and others at the Sackler Centre, has looked at different dimensions of interoception. And this was because previously the terminology and the way of assessing interoception covered many diverse techniques that combine together different facets of interoception that I believe need to be distinguished. So the first is interoceptive accuracy, and this is seeing how behaviorally accurate you are at detecting internal bodily signals such as the heart. And this can be done through traditional tests such as the heartbeat tracking task. So I would get you to count your heartbeats over time, over a specified time frame, and then essentially look at how many you report relative to how many heartbeats you actually have, and then have an accuracy number there. Or I might play you tones in sync or out of sync with your heart, and I'd get you to make synchronicity judgments. And here I could look at how accurate you are at performing these tests. There are also other tests looking at other bodily systems, such as the gut, that use sort of similar principles. And so we can look at accuracy measures. These can be contrasted to subjective measures, which we call sensibility, but really these are just subjective self-report measures. So if I got you to fill out a questionnaire and ask you how good you think you are at detecting internal bodily sensations, or how confident you are, then your self-report measures don't actually necessarily map onto your actual accuracy measures. And then the third dimension is a metacognitive accuracy measure, which is essentially the correspondence between the subjective and the objective. So, for example, using confidence accuracy correspondence, using area under an RAC curve, or meta D prime. And these three dimensions are distinguishable. And I'm based in psychiatry, and it's also, I've seen from the research that we've done, and I'll present to you today, that these really are important, these dimensions, because potentially they diverge more in clinical populations, and some are more impaired than others associated to distinct clinical conditions. And the relationship between interoceptive accuracy and emotion has long been known. So this is just to give you one example of prior work that's looked into this. They showed people different films, either funny films or angry films or films eliciting fear. And they divided individuals into those with high interoceptive accuracy, so those who are good at detecting their heartbeats, and those individuals with poor interoceptive accuracy. And what they found was that when they got people to rate how intense these films were, those individuals with high interoceptive accuracy would rate the films as more intense. So presumably they're able to use the detection of bodily sensations to inform the intensity ratings, intensity experience. So thus lending credence to this notion that the sensing of bodily sensations can inform emotional experience. And work by Hugo Critchley and others have identified the neurosubstrates involved in interoception as being located principally in the anterior insula. And if people do a heartbeat perception task in the scanner, they have shown that both insular activity and also grey matter volume of this anterior insular region is related to interoceptive accuracy. So here we have a neural substrate where both the density and the function is related to interoceptive accuracy. And if we also get people to do emotion tasks in the scanner, so assess how emotional they are, or show them emotional things, and also get them to do interoceptive tasks, and then do a conjunctive analysis in the brain, then Tara Sara, but also people like Kevin Ochsner have shown that it's the anterior insula, or areas of the insula that are involved in both emotion processing and bodily processing, again lending credence to the idea that, that this neurosubstrate is responsible for the sensing of bodily sensations to inform emotional experience. And I was interested with Hugo to look at autistic spectrum conditions in more detail, as this is a population where they often have impairments in their capacity to understand the emotions of self and other. So they are impaired in emotion processing. And this neurodevelopmental condition, emotion processing is a core feature of it. And also I was struck by the fact that they also display altered insular connectivity. So this, again, this core region involved in processing emotion and bodily sensations is impaired, both in terms of connectivity patterns, but also in terms of its degree of activation. So we looked at interoceptive accuracy in this population to see maybe they're impaired in their capacity to accurately detect bodily sensations, and wondered whether this could contribute to the deficits in emotion processing. And sure enough, we did find a significant reduction in their capacity to be interoceptively accurate. This contrasted with the self-report measure. So you ask them how good you think you are, and they think they're great. So again, it's like this dissociation between how good they think they are and how good they actually are. Jeff Bird has looked at alexithymia in autism, which is specifically the emotion processing component and also replicated this, but only in individuals with autism and high alexithymia. But then his results are sort of in broad agreement with this, demonstrating that emotion processing deficits in autism associated with alexithymia are indeed associated to reduce interoceptive accuracy. And James Kilner and Eleanor Passler have also extended this result to children with autism, showing that children with autism are also impaired at being interoceptively accurate. So it seems to be something that happens young, and it may be one of the components that leads to the continued emotion processing impairments in this population. So we can also explore altered interoception in terms of the difference between this objective behavioral accuracy component and this subjective self-report component by looking at the discrepancy between how good you think you are relative to how good you actually are. And we Z-scored both values and looked at the discrepancy between the two. We called it the interoceptive trait prediction error, which was how good you think you are relative to how good you actually are. Those individuals with autism are in red and they're elevated. And we found this propensity to be better relative to how good to think you're better than how good you actually are is associated with high trait anxiety. So if you think you're very good at interoception, but actually your body is doing stuff and sending signals and your heart is beating and you're not able to correctly identify that, then that's associated with high anxiety. So potentially a prior to think you're very good at interoception, but not be able to adequately process these internal bodily sensations seems to be associated with anxiety states. We've now extended this work outside autism in over 300 different patients with different affective conditions, bipolar, major depression and anxiety. And we found that those individuals with an anxiety diagnosis were those individuals with heightened interoceptive accuracy. Sorry, it's going the wrong way. So emotions are expressed in body and brain, and detecting emotion sensations can guide emotional experience. And emotion intensity can be informed by bodily signals. And deficits in interoception are linked to emotion processing deficits, and we can see this in autism and potentially relating to anxiety symptoms as well. And I now want to progress to the role between interoception and cognition, and this is something that we're really just starting to understand, the way in which sensing bodily sensations can guide our cognitive processing. At this point, I want to give a shout out to Mika Allen, who's doing some really lovely work on interoceptive signals and metacognition, what I won't be touching on today because he's here, but yeah, he's doing some lovely work in this regard. So what's wonderful about the heart is that it doesn't beat regularly. It is associated with patterned responses that can be elicited by different scenarios. And actually that's a healthy thing. You don't want a regular beating heart. So schizophrenia is a condition that's associated with a very regular beating heart. And that's not a good thing. And the level of variability in the heart signal has been shown to be adaptive. And you can look and study the variability in the heart signal using different paradigms to demonstrate different cardiac signatures that are associated with different states. And I've highlighted the experiment here of Polly et al. In 2007 to show how automatic this anticipatory signature is. So this is just during anticipation, so just waiting for the traffic lights can change. The beating of your heart such that it forms this classic classic deceleration curve. And in this experiment by Polly et al., what they did was they cued people to tell them what types of pictures they were going to see, and then you can see their heart starting to decelerate in frequency. And what I find so interesting about this was when they told them what different types of stimuli they would see, that the one that created the steepest deceleration curve was erotic couples that had a profound effect to slow down their heart. But what makes me laugh was that even when they told people they were going to see household objects, which were ironing boards and lamps, and really were the most boring stimulus set you could possibly imagine, nevertheless, the heart still adopted this pattern of deceleration. So it really is a wonderfully automatic thing that happens when you're anticipating the arrival of something. And so your heart then has embedded within it these different cardiac signatures which are meaningful. And my favorite experiment, I think, looking at how potentially intuitive decision-making can be guided by cardiac signatures is work by Barnaby Dunn. And what he did was he took this intuitive reasoning paradigm where people see a card and they need to choose one of 4 packs to say whether the colour of the card they choose will be same or different to the card here that's selected. And then unbeknown to them is that 2 of these packs are associated with a higher probability of being correct, and 2 of these packs are associated with a lower probability of being correct. And over time, people just potentially develop a gut feeling about, or just an intuition about which pack to go for. And what they find, really before people can verbally express any intuition, is that people do tend to go for the 2 profitable packs more than the 2 packs which tend to give wrong answers. But that when assessing bodily states, you can also see differences in bodily signatures associated with these 2 packs. So electrodermal response, that's the skin conductance response, falls relative to baseline for the 2 profitable packs and is elevated for the 2 negative packs. And then again, my favorite, the heart, you get greater a heart rate change, reduction in heart rate for the 2 profitable packs relative to the 2 negative ones. So there were different bodily signatures associated with these different packs. This was on average in the groups. They then looked at an individual measure of how much the bodily signature was meaningful and differentiating these packs, and they found that those individuals with favourable body differentiation for the packs with high interoceptive accuracy were also those individuals who had better intuitive ability. So it seems like your bodily signals being able to accurately represent whether a pack is a good choice or a bad choice, coupled with your capacity to accurately detect these bodily changes, were together predictive of high intuitive ability to pick the correct pack. And while that was a very elegant demonstration, I think, of intuitive decision-making, I'm going to present one of my own studies, which is not elegant at all. I find it was where I got sent to the London Stock Exchange to work with traders who claim to have very high intuitive ability. And these were high-frequency traders who were surrounded by computers with fast incoming information. And as they were high-frequency traders, they would make decisions in split seconds based on fast incoming data. And they would often say and report that they have very strong intuitive ability. So I went to test them to see whether, in fact, they did have higher interoceptive accuracy. much to my kind of frustration, they did. So they were actually more interoceptively accurate relative to a medic group that we tested and also a control group. And then when we ranked these individuals by virtue of their profit and loss statement, so this is how much money they were making in a given year, and we ranked them because there was such a variation in this. Those at the top were making 20 million a year or something ridiculous, and they were the ones that had an incredibly high or also perfect interoceptive accuracy. So what I also learned from doing this work was never collaborate with traders, and one of them was on the paper. So actually the most interesting data didn't get into the paper, which is the data I want to talk to you about now, which is, while we showed in this paper that they had high interoceptive accuracy, there was also preliminary evidence that we had that they had reduced metacognitive accuracy. So they didn't know they were good or poor. They didn't have any insight into their capacity to accurately detect these signals. So they had potentially good interoceptive channels, so good access to this information, able to guide their behavior. So they were able to act on it. That's a good trade, that's a bad trade, but they weren't necessarily able to attribute that to changes in their body, which is actually maybe what they needed, because they needed to have external attribution about the trades. And actually, if they had good metacognitive insight, they might have known more it was signals in their heart or body, and then discounted it as externally attributed to the trade itself, if you know what I mean. But I think more work delineating and separating these different interoceptive dimensions and their implication for decision making is needed. And now to take it into a clinical domain, and this is very, very new data, so we're still working on it, but just in its preliminary form, we looked at individuals with first episode psychosis and scanned them while they did a heart interoceptive paradigm, where they paid attention to their heart, or they paid attention to a note. And these notes were either played in sync or out of sync with their heart, and we could see how accurate they were. We could also look at their accuracy, confidence correspondence, and look at their metacognitive insight into this. And what we found was actually none of them were accurate. So accuracy was at chance during this performance. They also had reduced bilateral insular activation when performing this task. But what we found to be a strong predictor of dissociative symptoms in this population was, again, this metacognitive dimension. So those individuals with very poor metacognitive insight into their interoceptive processing tended to have greater dissociation symptoms. And this actually spans all the different subscales. I'm using the Cambridge Dissociation Scale. So they had greater feelings of derealization, that is alienation from surroundings. They had greater anomalous subjective recall. So they would have a greater feeling that the memories that they had, they didn't actually experience them themselves. And they'd have a greater emotional numbing and a tendency for greater anomalous bodily experience, so not thinking your body was your own. So it seems like this metacognitive dimension coupled to reduce insular activity is predictive of high dissociative experiences in this first episode psychosis population. So this first half of the talk has discussed how sensing bodily changes, both at an accuracy level and also at a metacognitive level, can potentially guide emotion and cognition, and can potentially be altered in clinical populations. And then the second part now is going to talk about how processing these bodily signals themselves can serve to change the way in which you perceive the world in different ways. So every time your heart beats, it sends a signal to the brain. You have located around the heart baroreceptors, which are stretch, pressure, sensitive receptors that are mechanoreceptors, and they get sort of pinged and activated, and they send signals to the brain, and your brain essentially flashes with each heartbeat, which I think is so wonderful. And also, I mean, it's not just the heart. You also have these other organs, also have afferent end projections that also lead to activity in the brain. So while you're all sitting there, your brains are activating in time with your heart. And you also have, for example, the slow wave of your stomach also represented in your brains right now. So you have this wonderful mixture of activity in the brain that's relating to the outside world, your hidden thoughts, and also activity related to your internal bodily organs. And I'm going to focus on the heart as it's easier to experimentally time stimuli to precise parts of the cardiac cycle to access this active channel to see how these cardiac signals can potentially alter in some way the way you're processing stimuli. And actually, some of these are old school experiments that inspired us, sort of from the 1970s, where they did all these experiments and they time locked stimuli to very precise parts of the cardiac cycle. So either an R wave, which is actually in between heartbeats, or what I'm going to call cardiac systole, T wave, which is just where baroreceptors are. This is the cardiac ejection periods right here, just before there, and the brain is activating in response to the heartbeat at this point here. And what has been shown from the 1970s is that if you time lock stimuli to exactly when the heart is beating at this, what I'm going to call cardiac systole, then stimulus processing tends to be inhibited. So if I was to give you a pain stimuli exactly when your heart was beating, then you would judge it as less painful. I'm not going to do that to you, but we do it in the lab, and we give pain stimuli in between heartbeats, and we see how the effect of heart can change pain perception. And I, along with Hugo Critchley, extended this into the domain of memory. So instead of using these sensory stimuli, we time block words to different points of the cardiac cycle. And what we found was that if you time presentation of words to different points in the cardiac cycle, but then give an incidental memory test later, then people tend to forget those words that were processed on the heartbeat relative to in-between heartbeats. So the heart has a deleterious effect on subsequent memory. And if we look at individual differences in interoceptive accuracy, although this is in a small sample, so I want to be cautious about it, it did seem to be that those individuals with high interoceptive accuracy were able to protect against this deleterious effect of the heart on memory. So is there something about knowing when your heart is beating or being able to predict it in some way that's able to protect against this detrimental effect of the heart on memory? And so this interoceptive channel was thought of since Lacey and Lacey's influential theory as a detrimental thing to stimulus processing, that cardiac signatures to the brain have a general inhibitory effect that interferes with stimulus processing. And it was my work with Hugo that really questioned that and said, no, actually maybe that's not always true, and that actually when the heart is beating, it puts the heart puts the brain in a state reminiscent of high cardiovascular arousal, with afferent projections ending up in the LC, insula, and amygdala, which are areas which are involved in salience and emotion processing. And maybe then if you time lock fear stimuli specifically, it might then be possible for the first time to see facilitated processing of stimuli. And so in this initial study, we time-locked fear faces or neutral faces to distinct parts of the cardiac cycle, either when the heart was beating and baroreceptors signal to the brain cardiovascular arousal, or in between heartbeats. And we got people to then make intensity judgments. And what we found was that stimuli time-locked to cardiac systole, so normally this inhibitory time, were judged as more fearful. It was a small but systematic effect that these stimuli, if they were fearful when time-locked to when the heart was beating, were judged as more fearful. But the opposite was true for neutral stimuli, where you just observed the classic inhibitory effect of the heart. So those were judged, although not significant, as less intense. And neural activity in the brain was coupled with the cardiac modulation of subjective intensity ratings, such that fear faces at systole had more amygdala activity bilaterally relative to fear faces at diastole, while the opposite was true for neutral. So the intensity ratings modulated by cardiac cycle mapped onto neural activation modulated by cardiac cycle. And work by our postdoc, Cassandra Gould, wanted to see whether we could then exploit this effect to see whether we could impact perceptual experience to take advantage of this fear facilitation effect when the heart is beating. And what she did was she time-locked two faces. So this is a binocular onset paradigm where two faces were presented, one to each eye. To the non-dominant eye was always a neutral face, and to the dominant eye was always a neutral face, and the non-dominant eye had a fear face. And this fear face tends to always be the one that dominates. So she then faded it and reduced the contrast at different gradations to look at the point at which it no longer dominates. So to look at how sensitive people are to fear at different points in the cardiac cycle. And so both faces were time-locked to diastole and both faces were time-locked to systole, and she did a thresholding paradigm to look at the threshold at which you get fear faces no longer popping through. And what she found that in those individuals with high interoceptive accuracy, there was a cardiac modulation effect. So those faces presented at diastole, which were fearful, could be at higher contrast, and those people were more sensitive to faded faces at systole. So there was a greater sensitivity for faded faces to still pop through in this onset paradigm at cardiac systole, but only in those individuals of high interoceptive accuracy. So only if you had a strong capacity to accurately detect when your heart was beating were you sensitive to this cardiac modulation of fear faces popping through for this onset paradigm. So we wrote a TICS paper to highlight some of these findings because it really was challenging a traditional view. It was just always thought since 1978 and Lacey that these heart effects were always inhibitory. And we've been able to show that no, actually the cardiac effects can selectively facilitate fear processing while other things are inhibited. And we have now expanded this effect into a number of different diverse domains. So we've shown it in subjective intensity judgments, we've shown it in neuromodulation in the brain, we've shown it in terms of perceptual experience and this binocular onset paradigm. Manos Sikiris and Rubin Azevedo have shown it in regard to decision making. So in a paper in Nature Communications recently, they had people make a split-second decision to shoot or not shoot, and showed more errors made at cardiac systole, a decision to shoot individuals, which were wrong. So they extended it into that decision-making domain, and we're also showing it in other realms of learning and memory. So these cardiac signals do have a propensity to facilitate the processing of fear. And once we've characterized this, we can also see how these cardiac signatures maybe operate differently in different clinical populations. And we've now extended this work in healthy controls, which show the typical effect of greater fear intensity at systole relative to diastole, so it's a positive number. We've shown that this propensity for cardiac signals to facilitate fear is heightened in individuals with anxiety, so they are having a greater propensity for these cardiac signals to heighten fear processing. This effect is not seen in depression, where these cardiac signals do not modulate emotion in the same way. And then in schizophrenia, you see no capacity for the cardiac signals to facilitate fear processing, and instead you just get this inhibitory effect of heart signals in fear processing. So this way of looking at cardiac signals and how they change stimulus processing is also able to give us insights into this body-to-brain axis that might be altered in different clinical conditions, and give us insight into these other mechanisms which could potentially be targeted with different treatments to alter processing. So, for example, beta blockers still, given anxiety, serve to reduce peripheral signals, and maybe this is the route through which this channel is being dampening down. So in this talk, I've talked about how we can sense internal bodily signals through the process of interoception to guide our emotion processing and also our cognition, such as through intuitive decision making. So these bodily signals and sensing them gives us an extra channel of information which can guide our cognitive and emotional experience. But also, these interoceptive bodily signals themselves can interact with brain to change the way you process information. I focused in this regard with precise cardiac afferent information, but actually other people are extending this to other organs. So work in Paris is looking at the stomach and how that can change emotion processing. There's someone also now looking at respiration and how when you process things at different points in the respiratory cycle, fear processing is also altered. So these bodily signals also have the capacity to change moment to moment the way we're processing information. And then that's, again, another wonderful thing about our brain, is that it's able to give us such a smooth percept of the world. I'd like to thank Hugo Critchley in particular, because he has served as my mentor and collaborator through all of this work. Also, other people in the lab, and thanks to my collaborators. Thank you for the ERC in particular, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing and has financed nearly all of this work. And thank you to you guys as well. Thank you.